All right. Good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, May 14th, and you were just telling me that there's some updates with regards to the whole Houthi story. So take it away.
Yeah. Yeah, there was something, it was actually a New York Times article that came out with, provided some additional detail about the decision to essentially give up on the Houthi bombing campaign. And it more or less confirms what we had said earlier, but I think it's actually of just earth-shaking importance. I think most people, a lot of people in the world are just ignoring it, but just what it's telling us about U.S. military power and about the current state of military technology. Yeah, there was, after a month of intensively bombing the Houthis, the the U.S. military realized that they just weren't making any headway, and they needed to make a decision, maybe to change their approach. Um, and actually, um, the U.S. commander for that region advocated an extended bombing campaign of 6 to 8 months to significantly degrade Houthi air defenses and maybe to carry out decapitation strikes too, of the sort that we saw in Lebanon under Israel. That plan was supported by Saudi Arabia, apparently, but it was opposed by UAE. And the UAE said, yeah, we tried that before. Remember, we fought the Houthis for years, and I think you're just underestimating their resilience. So it was decided to compromise and to have kind of to try to squeeze that 6 to 8 month campaign into a month. But at the end of the month, they just hadn't made any headway. And the problem was that they're running out of missiles and, drawing down their stockpiles, which, supposedly they need for other places like, again, Iran or China. So they decided, yeah, this isn't working. And that's why we got that so-called, agreement. It was nothing formal, but basically it was um, the U.S. halted the bombing campaign, and if the Houthis agreed not to attack U.S. flagged ships, and that's it. But attacks on Israel, on Israeli-linked shipping, that's still fair game for the Houthis. Now, another aspect of this, I thought, which was very, very interesting, is that, okay, if you remember, the U.S. Navy was sort of had retreated to the northern part of the Red Sea. Now, Yemen is down at the southern end of the Red Sea, so they were trying to maintain some distance. Their ships were under threat even up there, but it was just simply too dangerous to come down to head down south, and where Yemen is and where the ships would be, within really very short range of Houthi missiles. So but they were getting to the point where, these ships had to go back and refuel and reload. Like I've said, I think I mentioned earlier, it's actually not possible to reload them on the seas, especially certain kinds of missiles. You have to go back to special, naval bases to do that. Now you have a choice. Either you go through the Suez Canal or you head south, try to hugging the coastline opposite of Yemen. But both are really very dangerous. If you get into if you head south, then you're within really kind of, you make yourself an easy target for the Houthis, much easier than you are already. So that there was a real risk that, apparently, they understood that there was a real risk that one of their ships could be badly damaged or even sunk. But then if you go north through the Suez Canal, then you're a sitting duck when you're in the canal. And there is a potential that the Houthis could have fired a missile at one of the ships while it was in the canal, and it just has no maneuver room. And so they said, maybe we should just surrender, basically. Of course, they didn't use those terms, but that's what it was. No, I find this just remarkable again. It's just quite extraordinary, and I don't think it should be overlooked or diminished. But again, we're talking about the poorest country in the Arab world, one of the poorest countries in the world. And this is it. It essentially defeated, the U.S. Navy. And the U.S. Navy tried under two different presidents. Now, just stop and think what this means too. I mean, I think we have to draw some, you know, stop and think what the import of this event really is. Um, you know, one thing is like if the U.S. Navy was unable to achieve its objectives in the Red Sea and vis-a-vis the Houthis. Now, how is it going to do so against the Iranians? How is it going to do so against the Chinese, who both of these countries are, you know, much better equipped, you know, much wealthier, much larger, have better technology. How could it succeed? You know, we're talking about months and months of bombing already, you know, under Biden, and then another couple of months under Trump. And in those 2 months, I think, you know, it said like, you know, it was over $1 billion was expended every month. And then on top of that, we had the F-18s falling into the sea, and all the drones being shot down. It was, I think it was that initial figure that I gave, and I've heard was of $3 billion was about right. It certainly was close to that. And then stop and think also about some recent events, the claims of the Israelis. The Israelis said that, you know, they could, that they had eviscerated um, Iranian air defenses on that one very, really minor attack that they carried out. I think it was last October. You know, at first they didn't say that, but then the months after that they started making those claims. And then you just see it repeated in the Western media as fact. Are you telling me that the, you know, Israelis and not their planes didn't even get over into Iranian airspace because, like the U.S. planes that were, you know, flying these sorties against Yemen, they didn't dare to do it. They respected the air defense. You know, the U.S. has these F-35s and F-16s had to avoid Yemeni airspace. And certainly, you know, that's what we had heard about the F-35s that the Israelis flew back in October. You know, they discovered as they approached Iranian airspace that Iranian air defense had already locked onto them, and so they didn't dare actually fly into it. So you're saying that these planes somehow, on this one small, really relatively small scale attack, eviscerated Iranian air defense? You know, whereas after months of bombing the Houthis, you know, we decided we needed another 6 to 8 months, you know, that to actually seriously degrade the Yemeni air defense. It just doesn't hold water. It just doesn't. You know, I think it just exposes the lie entirely. And you had already pointed out that, well, look, you know, what um, um, the Russians have been pummeling the Iranians for, or not the
The
Iranians, right? The
Ukrainians.
Ukrainians for, they wouldn't do that. The Ukrainians for, you know, roughly 3 years with their missiles. And, you know, and seriously degrading their military capability. But even after all that time, um, Ukraine still has sufficient air defense. It's greatly degraded, but still sufficient that the Russians have to be cautious. So you're telling me again, you know, that the Israelis somehow eviscerated the Iranian air defense. Absurd. It's just total nonsense. It's amazing that anybody believes it. You know, I think, you know, people just aren't thinking. Again, these facts about what happened in Yemen, that wasn't, you know, a Russian talking point or claims of the Yemenis. This was what the U.S. commanders themselves reported to the New York Times.
So the bombing of Yemen, the Houthis, was largely pushed by Israel. This is the reason that we were getting into it. And the idea was that this would be the stepping stone to the path to war with Iran. But it sounds like it's actually backfired because it provided an educational experience once again for Trump and his administration, saying that you want us to go to war with Iran. And they realized that, hey, we can't even defeat the Houthis. Worse, we couldn't even, it sounds like what you're saying, that they couldn't even just give up the fight against the Houthis. They had to reach a deal because they were in danger of actually the U.S. Navy being trapped in the Red Sea, going through the Suez Canal where they might be vulnerable to missile attacks and there's no maneuverability there, or having to go by close to the coast of Yemen south where they would also be vulnerable. So instead of risking the possibility of some U.S. aircraft or Navy vessel sinking while it's trying to leave, they say, okay, we'll make a deal with you. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And this was public. This was in the New York Times, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Not all those, everything except, you know, I don't think the New York Times article covered, the quandary that they were in, like, the fact that they were up at the northern end and they had a choice between the Suez Canal. I got that information. I believe it was from Carl Jha, who's a Chinese commentator. But you stop and it just makes sense, right?
Hmm.
I mean, it's just logical. It's a logical conclusion. If they had to be up there, at the northern end of the Red Sea, as we know they were, and even there they were vulnerable. Yeah, they obviously were running a great risk by coming down south, and then yeah, you just lose the maneuverability once you get into the Suez Canal.
So the rest of the world, if this is so public, it's in the New York Times, and people can draw those conclusions about the U.S. Navy essentially being trapped. Then is the sort of the jig up for U.S. military might? Are maybe people haven't understood, but countries around the world should be aware of it, right?
Yeah, right. Well, again, I think even as a year ago or something, we say, well, the U.S. is really good at beating up on third world countries. And that was true back in the 1990s, the early 2000s, but it doesn't seem to be true anymore. It's this technological revolution that has really, and it has made, I wouldn't say navies obsolete, but highly vulnerable. And aircraft, not obsolete by any means, but it has limited their usefulness. And we saw it. I mean, if I don't think you could find a better demonstration than what we saw in Yemen.
Do you think Israel is aware of this?
I'm sure that many of the IDF commanders are aware of it. I'm sure they are. I don't know if Netanyahu was hearing it or he wants to hear it. That's the problem. Sometimes you get somebody, who believes so much in himself, he just stops listening to good advice. It's an old story. It goes back thousands of years. I know on another, I think I was our subscription only channel, I talked about the romance of the Three Kingdoms. But one thing, another recurring theme in that extraordinary historical novel is, you find the real disasters, the catastrophes that one kingdom or another makes is often because you have a commander or an emperor or a king who starts to believe too much in his own, in his own understanding, his own, in himself and his ability to lead. And you have these advisors who will tell him, oh, what you're doing here is very dangerous. But maybe he does it once and he succeeds, and he just thinks, I'm not going to listen to these people anymore. And then he goes off and they tell him again, oh, no, 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 like I got that last one wrong, but you succeeded, but this is going to be a disaster. Please, emperor or king, don't do it. I advise you don't. And he ignores them. He says he's supremely self-confident, and then catastrophe ensues. So this is something that's going on for a long time. And I think we may be seeing it happen in Israel as well.
With Israel, maybe there is a slight awareness, but I feel like Netanyahu feels like he has no choice.
That too, right?
And it's interesting because the further this has gone on, I think it's becoming more and more difficult to convince Trump and his administration to go to war with Iran. From this Houthi experience, the Mike Waltz, treason fiasco, and now we're seeing Trump visit all these Saudi Arabia, Qatar, not talking to Netanyahu, and then the more that Netanyahu tries to push for war with Iran, it's just the jig is up. He knows what he's doing now. I just feel like war with Iran. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but it feels like it could be off the table now just because Trump is aware of the military realities thanks to our involvement in bombing the Houthis. And then just this rift that he's experiencing with Netanyahu, realizing that, hey, this guy's been wanting to get me into this war, and I realize how disastrous it's going to be now. Is that how you're feeling?
Yeah, I am, but I remain cautious and for the reasons I think I've given before. First of all, we're talking about Trump. And then, we've had this happen in the past where you say, wow, Trump he's barreling ahead in the right direction. And then he does a 180, and so there's just always that risk. But I think you're right. I mean, it's just a accumulation of events makes me more confident that he's going to, he's going to avoid war with Iran. And it's just the facts. I think I've also made this again and again. The reason that Iran hasn't been attacked anytime in a significant way um, during the last 20 years is its deterrent capability. And I think the Yemenis, and this is probably one of the reasons, they have various reasons for supporting the Houthis, but they, through the Yemenis, they have demonstrated again, actually, further demonstrated their deterrent capability. And it has to be, it has to be on the minds of all these Pentagon leaders. They're saying, boy, this would be just such a humiliation. Now, I don't even know why, after all this, anybody should be talking about a war against Iran. And I think it really may be off the table for now. And I find the most compelling piece of evidence, something just came to my mind. The B-2s that had been flown to Diego Garcia apparently have been flown back to San Diego or wherever they were previously based. So that kind of tells you, yeah, they're not even thinking about it right now. Now, it's just always there's Trump and there are all these crazies in his administration. There's Netanyahu. There could be a false flag. So we're not out of the woods, yet, not by a long shot. But yeah, I am encouraged.
I was just reading a New York Times article right before we started this. I'll read you the headlines. I thought it was interesting. It says, Iran proposes novel path to nuclear deal with U.S. Iranian officials said their foreign minister had proposed a joint nuclear enrichment venture involving Arab countries and American investment. So my understanding is this would be a consortium involving Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and it would allow for Iran to have its civil nuclear program, and it would actually be enriching uranium for the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates for their potential civil nuclear program. And this, I guess, would provide some investment opportunities for the United States. It's an interesting idea, but it just I don't know if it's going where, because also the article says that Wickoff denies that we've been talking about this, but the Iranians are saying that I guess this is a proposal that they're looking at. But it sounds like they're desperately, the Iranians are doing what they can to avoid what is a deal breaker for them, which is, no enrichment at all,
Right.
no civilian nuclear program. That's off the table. But if they're able to combine it with some arrangement with the other Arab countries, and the fact that he's currently in Qatar right now, but he had a very interesting visit in Saudi Arabia, and maybe Trump's all about making a deal. And I think with this deal proposed as well, there's no expiration date. It applies for increased oversight. So who knows? Maybe there is some possibility that something like that can happen. And if it does, I mean, what are these really going to do? They just seem like it's like they should be okay with that, right? That we have all this oversight, countries inspecting it, that there isn't going to be a nuclear weapon, and that all these Arab countries that, I mean, countries have civilian nuclear programs. It's normal. I mean,
It's
France,
completely legal.
Japan. I mean,
Right.
Nuclear energy is a great thing.
Right. It's a right under the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and Iran is a signatory to that. They have that right. There's no question about it. There's no reason why they really even should submit to these, extra inspections and controls and so forth. They're just willing to do it as for their own security.
Right. So I'm feeling more hopeful, but with how it is with Trump. It's like, don't do this to me, man. You get my hopes up, and then you just do a 180. So, actions speak louder than words. We had a lot of good words from Trump recently coming out of the Saudi Arabia trip. I sent you that clip.
Right.
I actually have it here. I think it'd be good just to play it, and we can kind of take it from there and talk about this. This trip that he's doing throughout the Middle East. Okay, let's.
It's crucial for the wider world to note this great transformation has not come from Western interventionalists or flying people in beautiful planes giving you lectures on how to live and how to govern your own affairs. No, the gleaming marvels of Riyadh and Abu Dhabi were not created by the so-called nation builders, neocons, or liberal nonprofits like those who spent trillions and trillions of dollars failing to develop Kabul, Baghdad, so many other cities. Instead, the birth of a modern Middle East has been brought by the people of the region themselves, the people that are right here, the people that have lived here all their lives, developing your own sovereign countries, pursuing your own unique visions and charting your own destinies in your own way. It's really incredible what you've done. In the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, and the interventionists were intervening in complex societies that they did not even understand themselves. They told you how to do it, but they had no idea how to do it themselves. Peace, prosperity, and progress ultimately came not from a radical rejection of your heritage, but rather from embracing your national traditions and embracing that same heritage that you love so dearly.
Yeah.
He almost sounds like us.
Yeah, I know. It's quite extraordinary. I mean, it was a very, I think, almost, yeah, I think you could say an eloquent statement on behalf of multipolarity and a condemnation of, of the neocon way of doing things. It's quite extraordinary. I was going to say that maybe he's a closet, advocate of multipolarity, but there he is saying it out in the open. It's again, he'll do some things. I think probably the one really big blind spot is Israel and Zionism. And maybe that black spot, where he, is through Zionism, he acts just as, maybe it's fair to say that he's not a neocon in the sense that he's trying to push the neocon ideology, but an outright imperialist. He supports, let's say, Israeli imperialism, Israeli domination, and that's the unfortunate exception. But I've said many times he's not a neocon, and I think that speech showed it better than anything else. He is an America firster, which in his mind means that he gets to bully other countries, and he's tried to do that, but he's finding that outside of his own hemisphere, it just doesn't work, right? It hasn't worked against China. It didn't work against the Houthis. He's realizing it won't work against Iran, and so maybe he's slowly abandoning or, tempering, I wouldn't say abandon, but, becoming more realistic about America's power, and so I think this latent belief in multipolarity that was always there. One thing is that unlike the neocons, who want to export the Western ideological revolution to the rest of the world and insist on everybody having basically the same system of government and the same social system. And, you've never seen that. He doesn't make those kind of arguments. He bullies countries and whatever, but it's just a question of raw power. And then when he sees that, okay, this raw power, we don't really have it in the amounts that we thought we did, he becomes more realistic. Let's hope that trend continues.
Right. And we've said this before so many times, but it always seems like Trump seems to echo whoever he talked to last, that his mind changes quickly. But what I'm hoping for, what we're seeing is that with the expulsion of Mike Waltz, and we're hearing statements that he's shutting out AIPAC, that he's upset with them. So maybe he's been able to replace those Zionist, neocon war hawks in his administration with something more rational. And so you wonder, who wrote this speech for him? Is this who has Trump's ear? Because that seems to be all important. Because if that person gets removed and then we get a new Mike Waltz in there, then we'll be back to his speech like there'll be a bombings like we've never seen before. Because we had that type of rhetoric literally just months ago, right, that with threats to Iran and this, and here he's talking about.
Also, right, we're still getting these threats, like he's saying that no, Iran shall not export its oil to any country in the world. It's got to end entirely, not a drop. You're getting these kind of threats, but he's not carrying through on them, and it is less than an all-out bombing campaign. So, yeah, I think that characterization of Trump that he echoes who he spoke to 10 minutes earlier. There's quite a bit of truth to that, but it's not entirely true. He does have, I think, a core orientation that you see, comes out again and again over the years. Like he clearly does. He clearly isn't a neocon, and I think you can see it through both actions, even when some of these actions are really terrible. But in his rhetoric, and not just the rhetoric of this that we heard in this speech, but over the course of years. And he's always favored tariffs, for example, and protectionism. That's something that goes years and years and years back. He does have some core beliefs, but they get, because of, I think, a number of factors, often his failure to grasp the details of a situation. He gets talked into something. People understand that he has these attitudes. Let's just you give Russia and the Ukraine war as an example. Yeah, he really does want to end it. But he doesn't have a grasp of all the details, and he doesn't fully understand, what's happening in Russia. And he has some impressions. Some of them are accurate, some of them are inaccurate. But people who understand that about him and want to sabotage, any sort of peace between the U.S. and Russia will say, well, yeah, this is a great, we can make these negotiations succeed. But the way to do it is just to apply some more pressure to Russia. They just another package of sanctions, et cetera, et cetera. You have to escalate to de-escalate, meaning, so I think sometimes, he falls for these tricks, and he does like to threaten. He likes to as we've seen again and again, to threaten that all hell will break loose, you're going to experience the fury of the United States Air Force, etc. He likes to say these words, and somebody can encourage to say, this is actually going to be in service of your peace plan, President, if you do this, and he can fall for it. But it seems like he'll fall for these things, and he finds out they don't work, and then he kind of goes back to his core orientation, which is basically, we'll say multipolarism, but with the U.S. as the top dog. But again, he's starting to realize that the U.S. isn't as top a dog as he once believed.
Okay, well, let's dive into this Saudi Arabia trip right now, just his trip in the Middle East. Well, what do you make of it so far? Do you feel like this is a historic trip, or are we reading too much into it?
Well, okay, yeah. What I've heard is that some big deals were made there. The Saudis agreed to buy hundreds of billions of dollars worth of U.S. arms, and also to invest something like $600 billion in the U.S. economy, and Qatar and the UAE said similar things. So there's the businessmen are inking deals, or starting to work out the details and all this. And this is the kind of thing Trump likes to do. I think this is vintage Trump. I think he probably really loves it there, because they're good at pomp and ceremony, and they're kings, and I think he would like to be a king. And the gift of the 747 is something that I think that really tickled him. So it's something, it tickles his own ego, but then it's also, he likes to be a deal maker. He's a businessman, and this is what he understands. And that's what he really thinks, that's the way countries should interact with each other. And I agree, that's a much better way to do it, to do things, than to actually, launch wars. It seems clear to me, in spite of some of his actions, that he is not a warmonger. That's not his preferred course. That's not his natural instinct. He gets sometimes talked into it, but that's just not the way he wants to do things. I think this is Trump doing what he wants to do, and he would love to be able to do that all around the world.
Yeah, I'm okay with that kind of Trump. Let him go around the world, talk to everybody, and try to work out deals. I think that's good to have communication.
Like 747s.
Yes, well, better than bombing countries, right? It's
right. Yeah, I mean, there is a whiff of corruption there, but again, I agree. I'd rather have a corrupt president, and maybe a very vain and rather let's say
Just bombastic.
yeah, bombastic president than an ideological zealot who might be very highly intelligent and as clean as the driven snow when it comes to his observance of procedure, but he's launching wars that lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands. And yeah, give me the bombastic, deal making president any day.
Right. So there are a couple of things that I've heard that I want to confirm if they're true or not. One is that there's going to be a normalizing of relations with Syria, and a potential lifting of all sanctions on Syria. And it seems like, Al-Jilani, I don't understand. I guess was he going to be an interim leader, but now it seems like he's solidifying his position in Syria. Should we expect Al-Jilani really to be the new president of Syria long term, and that this is I don't know what to make of it, because he used to, he used to be an Al Qaeda ISIS guy. There was a $10 million bounty on him as a terrorist, and now he's
just a few months ago.
Until just a few months ago, right? Right. And now we're making these deals with him, and it seems like he's got the backing of MSB and Erdogan. So what's going on here?
Yeah, well, I think he always had the backing of Erdogan and the Saudis and the Gulf states. I think.
Or MBS, that MSB. Sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Right. Mohammed bin Salman.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's always had their backing, and he's really basically now a puppet of Erdogan. I think as long as Erdogan wants him to be there, he will be there. He's there because of Turkey's support for the jihadists there. So, yeah, I mean, I would say it's a good thing, that the sanctions are lifted. They should have been lifted a long time ago. They should have never been imposed. They were very cruel. They've caused a lot of misery in Israel. Not Israel, in Syria. A lot of misery in Syria. And I think we're to a great degree responsible for the fall of Assad. Okay, but now, I am obviously no supporter of Jolani, but it's just regardless, the people are suffering. These sanctions should be lifted. Now, yeah, I don't know what, again, we have seen atrocities already. It's not like we haven't seen them go into full Al Qaeda or ISIS mode, but there are those kind of people running around the country doing terrible things. And if you pay attention, there have been massacres, and just most recently, when I think like all the students left the university in Damascus, all the non-Sunni students, basically the Alawites, the Christians, the Druze, and to return to their respective regions because they just don't feel safe. That gives you an idea of what's going on. There is, it's not kind of completely unrestrained sectarian violence. And it doesn't seem to be, maybe I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem to be systemic, being coordinated from the top. It's just that you have these bands of people that they are, takfiris. They do believe that anybody who doesn't adhere to their version of Sunni Islam is an infidel and should be subjugated, captured, or killed. And they are acting on that in different parts of the country. Not everywhere all the time, but that's what we're seeing. Now it looks. I think the Israeli plan was clear from the start. They want to balkanize. This is what they've always wanted to do. Is just break up Syria, and they've taken steps. They've captured territory directly that they have under their direct control, but then they've extended a zone essentially, through all southern Syria, saying no, where they won't tolerate the presence of any significant Syrian forces. And then they declared themselves to be the protectors of the Druze. And again, it puts the Druze in a very difficult spot. It's just like, they don't love the Israelis. In fact, I remember going to the Golan Heights back there in, 2011. And we visited a center there, and the Druze are the head of that organization. I forget what it was called. He was a Druze, and he emphasized that he said we are Syrians. He said because of course at that time until Trump's first term. That all the countries in the world, including the United States, recognize the Golan Heights as Syrian territory. And they just, they would show maps where, the Golan Heights, like we're part of Syria. This is our country. We want to return. The Israelis need to withdraw. But of course, that hasn't happened. And the Assad's government fell. You have, a jihadist, maybe he is somewhat of a reformed jihadist. That's possible. I mean, people, as they get older, they can change their views, moderate them, but he still is clearly sectarian. And, the people on the ground, the many minorities in Syria do not feel safe now in places like Damascus and are starting to move, to different areas of the country, would it be with their fellow co-religionists. So, yeah. So the Druze are, they're in a tight spot. They don't love the Israelis, but if you get a choice between Al Qaeda and Israel just wants to use you, they want to use you, but they have no plans to kill you outright. Now, maybe some decades in the future, they'll decide that this is part of the greater Israel and they will start killing you the way they're killing the Palestinians. But at this point, it's probably the best deal for them to take. You can understand why they might say, okay, we'll just have to accept this alliance of some sort with Israel.
It's crazy. So what is al-Jilani's relationship with Israel? Is part of this deal to normalize relations with Israel, have the Abraham Accords with Syria, and then sanctions are off?
Right. Yeah, that's a crazy thing. I mean, that you have all these, you would think that these Takfiris and, the Al-Qaeda types and the ISIS types, that they would be mortal enemies of Israel. I think in the long run, that's what they think. But they have made their peace, and it didn't begin with al-Jilani. It was early on in the Syrian civil war that we started hearing reports that the Israelis were actually providing support to al-Nusra, which is Syrian Al-Qaeda fighters in southern Syria. They're providing them with medical treatment, for example, and also reports that they were providing them with small arms. This is something that goes back. And of course, the U.S. has done similar things in Afghanistan and other places. And so, you have this very strange alliance. Again, that's not new. It goes all the way back to bin Laden, between Western powers and these extreme Takfiris. Again, we're talking about Al Qaeda and ISIS. That's exactly what we're talking about. Who they're supposed to be our mortal enemies, but we just can't resist the temptation to make these alliances with them, alliances of convenience, because it seems like at the end of the day, the people in Washington and Tel Aviv, they're more obsessed with overthrowing these governments that actually resist. Have resisted Israel, like Assad's government and the current Iranian government. I think the reason is, this is the calculation that they're making, is that, Al-Qaeda, they're a bunch of barbarians. They're good at killing people, but they're not really good at running a society, and they can't really organize a modern military and become a threat to us. I think that's what they figure. Whereas Assad and certainly Iran, that's different. This is an organized modern. These are organized modern societies and militaries, and they present they're real rivals to us, and so they must be taken out. And if we can use the Al Qaeda to do it, so much the better.
Okay. So it's interesting because Syria is supposed to try to normalize relations with Israel, even though that they're Sunni extremists and Israel is slaughtering Sunni Muslims in Gaza and the West Bank, but
Right.
somehow they're okay with that. But then also at the same time, I'm hearing rumors that Trump is brokering some deal with Saudi Arabia, allowing them to have a civil nuclear program, and it would not come with the strings attached that Saudi Arabia has to normalize relations with Israel, recognize Israel, and back into the Abraham Accord. So it's kind of interesting that you have one, Syria, that has to normalize, and Saudi Arabia saying we won't, and we can still get a nuclear deal, nuclear program. Can you tell me about this? Is this true?
Yeah, it may very well be true. I mean, I've just heard, I guess they're rumors at this point. I don't know, maybe more than rumors. I could see it happening. It's just that Saudi Arabia, I think, may have been contemplating normalization of relations with Israel prior to October 7th. But because of, what Israel has done since then, it's just impossible. Even if the people at the top just don't really give a damn about the Palestinians. And I think that by and large that's true. Unfortunately, it's true of the leaders of a lot of Sunni regimes. The people on the street, the average people do, and they're furious. And he knows for these monarchs and generals like General El-Sisi, they know that their own positions, are at risk if they go ahead and recognize Israel, without certainly, and allow them to continue what they're doing. So, I could see that Saudi Arabia is going to say no, but Al-Jalani, or Al-Shara, I guess he likes to call himself too now, take your pick. He is in a rather desperate situation. He does have the support from Turkey, but he's being bombed regularly by the Israelis, and the Israelis are taking more and more of his territory, and he really is defenseless. His, that modern military that Syria had has been largely destroyed, and he can't resist them. So he does need the help of the U.S. and he needs peace with Israel. So he's gonna ask for it, which seems rather extraordinary. But yeah, I mean, that's a policy that goes back, we all the way back to 2011, we saw that there was this actual alliance of convenience between Israel and the Sunni extremists.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we'll see how this plays out. I don't know where else Trump has on his tour. I just know he's in Qatar now, but a lot happening in the region, and I don't know. I'm getting a little hopeful that things can work out better in the Middle East, that we could avoid war with Iran. Syria's situation is a massive quagmire. I almost don't like thinking about it.
Yeah, it's such a tragedy. It's just awful, and it was all unnecessary. And we are, it's not that we are entirely responsible for it, but we contributed greatly to the current situation. Through the sanctions and through seizing of the oil producing and wheat growing regions of Syria. But, the one who was, if you're most responsible again for the fall of Assad, was Erdogan.
Yeah. These players are complicated. I did that. I just never understood fully Erdogan's motivations and his ideas with Syria, but I know about creating the Ottoman Empire a bit, but we won't get into that.
Yeah. Well, I think just to be very brief, there is this neo-Ottoman thinking. He wants to expand, the Turkey and restore something of its former Ottoman glory. But then also, I think it's clear that he does have an affinity for the Sunni extremists. I think there's no question about that.
Okay, well, let's move over to Ukraine because I think we're running a little bit out of time. So it's what's going on? There's this meeting in Istanbul coming on Thursday, and from my understanding, Zelensky says he's going to go in person, but he will only talk to Putin. So what's happening here?
Yeah. Well, the Russians have declared that they are sending in a negotiating team to Istanbul. They will be there on Thursday. They haven't actually named the members of the team, but they have said, officially declared they are sending a negotiating team. And now, Zelensky at first was insisting on, ceasefire first. The Europeans were insisting on it too. Ceasefire, or no negotiations. Ceasefire and then negotiations was their position, and they seemed to be firm on it. And I think it was back on Tuesday or something. They said, "Yeah, we're just hours away from imposing the sanctions if the U.S. doesn't agree to our ultimatum." Though they didn't use the word ultimatum, but what in fact was an ultimatum. If they don't agree to it, the sanctions will go into effect, at midnight tonight. Well, when the clock kept on ticking, they haven't. And I think the reason is that Trump pulled the rug out from under him. Because when he heard that it seemed like he had been part of that team, that he had been roped in, to be part of the European Kiev team, that presented this ultimatum. But when Putin came back and with his counter proposal, Trump leapt on it and said, "This is great. This is what has to be done." And so they was just pulled the rug out from under their feet, and they had to, okay. So they have delayed the sanctions. They said, okay, yeah, now there will be negotiations. And Zelensky, who was saying that no way, you have to have a ceasefire first. He's flip-flopped too. But now he's saying that I'm going to go there personally, and Putin has to show up. And if he doesn't, then, that'll show that they're not serious. Because, this is the way he explains it, Putin is the guy who makes the decisions. So there's no point in talking to anybody else, which is just absurd. This is real low IQ. I don't know that he really believes it is, but it just seems so silly that anybody would take that seriously. It's sort of like saying, well, even if Putin were a dictator, which he isn't, not by, any stretch of that definition. But even if he were, a dictator normally can send his deputies. He can authorize them, to represent them and give them in negotiations. That's the way things are normally done. It's kind of like saying you go to a country and a police officer tries to arrest you for a traffic violation or something, or fine you. And you say, "No, you can't do that. I'm not accepting your authority because I know in your country, the only guy who makes decisions is, the big boss upstairs. So I'm not listening to you." It's on the same level. It's just ridiculous. So anyway, but it's what Zelensky does. He just wants to be there, kind of gate crashing. And then that's what he's going to, I think he's going to try to do in Istanbul.
Do you think that
I don't think it's not impossible that Putin will show up, but I think it's highly unlikely.
Do you think it would be a good move if he showed up?
I don't think so. I mean, maybe,
it could be,
I don't know.
Right? It could be. It just calls
Yeah, or maybe
out.
I don't know.
Right. It's just like Zelensky's making this ridiculous demand because he thinks that Putin won't show up, and then if Putin shows up, and Putin, that he's calm, cool, and collected.
Yeah. Right.
Zelensky is going to be probably coked up out of his mind and going nuts. And if there are other people that are in the room that are involved with it, like if Steve Witkoff and Kellogg are there, then things start to become apparent that, okay, Zelensky is being on a hinge. We have this cool rational actor that's actually trying to get to a settlement. I think it'll backfire on him. So
it could. I don't know. It's a really crazy situation. And
but I just,
it's kind of a circus.
Right, but everything the past 2 or 3 years is a bit of a circus. And with Trump coming into office, it's been, everything has been more unorthodox. Like the way that deals are being settled and the rhetoric that we have, it doesn't seem to be going by the norms anymore. Yeah. So it's just
but also it's not working. I mean, like in the case of Russia, Ukraine, the Trump approach just hasn't been working.
Right. But that's why I'm saying this might work.
I don't see how it would work. I mean, again, I think the truth is the two sides are so far apart that, there is not going to be any meeting of minds and any, handshake deal. That's just not going to happen. It's just no way. And it doesn't really, I don't think, bringing the respective presidents into the same room doesn't do any good. I think it would be a good thing if, like, the negotiating teams met quietly, and it should just be quiet because it's a mistake to put a lot of expectations. They're very far apart. But as they start talking, that's a good thing. If you make it a regular thing, and over time, I think you can eventually start to see some shifts, especially as battlefield realities continue to, go against the Ukrainians. At some point, they might see that, oh God, we do have to make a deal. They're just not going to do it now. Now, well, it's kind of interesting. What is actually the Ukrainian? What are they looking for in this? They had always been against any kind of ceasefire, and then in the last couple of months, they caved in on that and they started to agree to a ceasefire. And I think maybe it was largely because of pressure that was put on them by the U.S. But it may be more than that. They used to argue, or at least it was argued in the press. I remember a year ago and earlier that, yeah, a ceasefire would be a terrible idea because it would give the Russians a time to rest and rearm um, and but you're not hearing that because I think everybody knows that the Ukrainians are losing. And the Ukrainians have to know it better than anybody. Maybe some of these Europeans don't really know that the Ukrainians are losing or how badly they're losing, because I think they get their information from the Ukrainians themselves, and the Ukrainians always try to paint a rosy picture. But they themselves have to know that they're losing, and they themselves have to know that a ceasefire actually would be very helpful at this point, especially with the likelihood, as the Ukrainians themselves are starting to report, that there is a major offensive looming on the horizon. And if they really see that coming and they see they're losing, yeah, go for a ceasefire. Um, and so there may actually be a hope among the Ukrainians that there is a ceasefire. But at the same time, it just seems like they're not going about it in a realistic way. Because, again, it's like joining the Europeans to making all these ridiculous, this ultimatums. That's just obviously not going to work, and they have to know it. So they still haven't kind of, it seems clear to me, they haven't climbed down from their kind of self-created PR position. They still aren't really grappling with reality, but maybe at some point they will. They'll have to. I mean, the reality will become grimmer and grimmer to the point where they simply have to. I don't see it happening right now, but if we start negotiations, maybe eventually it will happen.
So do you think negotiations are going to start on Thursday? I mean, just tomorrow?
Yeah, well, I'm afraid it's not going to go anywhere because it looks like the Ukrainians are going into this, certainly Zelensky himself. He's not going into it, with any sincerity. It's, he sees it as another PR, event, which is just part of the information war. And he can try to, again, make the Russians look like the orcs from the East. And if you were really serious about a ceasefire, you would send a negotiating team and you would start to make some goodwill gestures. That's another thing, is that you look like some of these ceasefires that the Russians institute. You say, well, yeah, that's only a 1-day ceasefire. That's a 3-day ceasefire. But if the Ukrainians had agreed to them, those would have been goodwill gestures and would have actually signaled to the Russians that, hey, yeah, we are serious about talking. But their failure to observe them kind of, I think, sends a signal that we are not serious about this. And above all, there was that energy infrastructure ceasefire that was 30 days long, and that Zelensky verbally agreed to. But they, in fact, intensified their attacks on Russian energy infrastructure during that time. So, I mean, that just, again, sends a signal, we're not really interested in a ceasefire or peace with you at all. So, even if they're starting to realize that, hey, maybe a ceasefire, they still, it seems like they still haven't really come to grips with it, and they're still fighting this information war, and they're still doing whatever they can to sabotage any kind of Russian, effort at starting negotiations.
But they are sending a team, or Zelensky's going in person.
Yeah,
and
that's what I've heard. I don't know if they're sending a team or not. And Zelensky
sure
says
he isn't going to roll in solo, is he?
No, he's got to be some people with him.
Right.
I don't know. I don't see how it's going to go anywhere. I don't think. Again, the two sides are so far apart, and the Ukrainians. If the Ukrainians were at least kind of sobered up, maybe got off their coke or whatever it is, then you would say, okay, well, don't expect any breakthroughs here, but maybe this become the beginning of a process that could lead to something. but we're talking about, a year or 2 years down the road, probably. That's a realistic thing to do. But there are, I think, unrealistic expectations among people who, very properly hope for peace. And there seems to be, to me, to be a lack of sincerity. Maybe you can see on both sides, certainly on the Ukrainian side. I mean, the Russians, at least, are sending a team. That's what you do if you're going to do negotiations. If it's just Zelensky on the other side, that's just absurd. That shows that you're just grandstanding. You're not actually serious about negotiations.
Interesting. I know I've heard rumors that both Steve Witkoff and General Kellogg are going to be going to Istanbul on Thursday as well. So
Right.
who knows? I don't even know if this thing is happening. Just because of what Zelensky is saying I will only talk to Putin.
Right.
I'm going there. Putin, you better show up. It's almost like you in middle school when you dealing with somebody like meet me outside after school. In the parking lot kind of thing.
Yeah.
That's the feeling I get. It's but
Yeah.
and so then usually those things don't pan out. It's like I'm not going to meet you in the parking lot. Whatever, I'm going home.
Yeah.
But I was thinking that if Kellogg and Witkoff are going, maybe because we're always wondering like what's Kellogg doing? Kellogg seems to be presenting plans that are just completely unrealistic, completely ignoring all of Russia's interests and demands and ignoring the fact that Russia is clearly winning this war. So we have to acknowledge what Russia is saying. And then Witkoff seems to have an understanding of Russia's position and is more, I wouldn't say in Russia's camp, but is willing to talk to them. I mean, we have to understand we're a co-belligerent here. But I'm wondering if the idea is if they send both Witkoff and Kellogg, it just seems like that's a weird combo. They're not on the same page. But maybe the idea is that Kellogg is kind of in the Ukrainian camp. Witkoff is more in the Russian camp. And just that in itself might lend to the ability to have a bit of a dialogue because you have Kellogg that is sort of representing the Ukrainians in a way, and then Witkoff that's kind of representing the Russians in a way. And it can maybe just bring them a little bit closer to kind of have some middle ground. Do you think that's possible? I mean, is that what the thinking is? Because you're wondering, like, why is Kellogg even here? What's Kellogg doing?
Yeah, there's first of all, I've heard that they're going there. They're as observers. So I don't know.
They're not their lawyers.
I don't know if that means that they, sit at the table or they are in the next room or if they, stand against the wall and watch or something. I don't
binoculars,
know right. I really don't know what that means. But yeah, so there's a real question. It's like, why does Trump have Kellogg there? I think it's clear the guy that he likes is Witkoff. He's his actual personal friend and trusts him to do just about everything under the sun. But Kellogg is constantly going on TV and saying things like, essentially just declaring that like the NATO requirement, that NATO non-membership requirement that the Russians have put forward, is that something that we can ignore, or so somewhere down the road we could change that? And he's saying these things out loud, and he's talking about this plan to send European troops there. What we're hearing from Macron and Starmer, he's clearly on board with that, and he's saying all this out loud, and it's often contradicting things that Trump had said earlier or Witkoff had said, and I don't know why Trump doesn't tell him to just shut up, but this is something that we've seen all along. It's just chaos within this administration. They're not speaking with a unified voice. And, at one time, I think like Marco Rubio was saying, he was saying that, the ceasefire, they have to agree to it or there will be consequences. No ceasefire, no negotiations. And then Trump went off and, I think he even said that after the first time Trump made that statement, that, wonderful negotiations. But the policy, it was still, had been worked out within the administration, within the State Department that, no, we're doing the European plan. But then now, when you contact the State Department or a reporter does, they say, we don't know what's going to happen on Thursday. And for the moment, the threats of sanctions those are off the table, at least for the time being. It's just total chaos. I don't know what's going to happen.
So do you think that there will be at least some type of talks on Thursday, or do you think we
There
really
might
don't
be.
know?
I really don't know. I think only a fool will predict is what happened. It's going to be, I don't know. Maybe they'll actually put on clown outfits and run around in circles. I don't know.
The whole thing's so crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, all right. Well, we'll wait and see. I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about on Friday. Before we end this, just one other thing. You were talking about some updates with India Pakistan thing, because
Oh,
I was asking you prior a week ago that there were Chinese weapons that the Pakistanis were using. Do we
right.
know anything about their efficacy? And you said there's some updates there.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's actually been a lot of buzz about this. Now, there's apparently five Indian jets were shot down, and they were shot down by, well, not all of them actually. I think one was shot down by air defense. There were three Rafale jets. Those are French jets, and they're supposed to be state of the art. Like the best that Europe can produce. Um, Two of them were shot down by the Chinese jets. They're J-10C, I believe, and one by air defense. And then there were two Russian jets. One was a MiG-29, which is actually a Soviet era jet, so it's really quite old. And then the other was an Su-30, and I think an older model of that. So that's actually not quite as old as the MiG-29, but it's an older model. A total of five jets, and so there's been a lot of buzz about this, on the internet. Say that this is a demonstration of the potency of Chinese arms. And I would say, okay, I think a word of caution. I think this is something that Scott of Calibrated with Scott. That's another channel that's worth. He's very, very good at maps and a lot of the technical military issues. But he made the point, and I think it's a valid one, that it's really a mistake to see too much into this very brief conflict. Because we're just talking about a few days. Inexperienced pilots, and a lot of chaos. And I don't think you can jump to conclusions. You can't say that this is conclusive, like this is a conclusive, demonstration of the superiority of Chinese arms. I would say it's suggestive, however. That the fact that they were able to shoot down particularly these Rafale jets. Now, there was one Chinese analyst that pointed out something, very important. It's not so much like the superiority of the J-10C, which is an older Chinese model. Actually, it's something that they are retiring from their own Air Force. They're still exporting it, but they've moved well beyond it. But it doesn't so much demonstrate its superiority vis-a-vis the Rafale as demonstrates the potency of the overall Chinese package. Because what Pakistan did is it bought a total integrated package. They bought the fighters, the missiles, the air-to-air missiles, the PL-15 that actually struck the Rafales and brought them down. The air defense system and AWACS, all from China, and all these are integrated. So, for example, when a J-10C it fires one of these PL-15s, that missile is guided in mid-course, actually by the AWAC, which is monitoring the position of the Rafale over Indian airspace, and corrects its course on the way. All these things work together. And that makes it a very, very potent package. And one of the big problems that India has is that it bought its planes and its air defense and from a lot of different sources. Some of these are very good systems in themselves, but they're not integrated with each other. And that really it's a hodgepodge, and that puts them at a disadvantage. So anyway, I just found that quite interesting. Again, I think like Scott of Calibrated with Scott pointed out, this is not conclusive. This is a very brief war. If you observe something over a period of months, then you can, I think, come to firm conclusions about superiority of one kind of system over another. At this point, we can only say that, hey, yeah, this is definitely, a win or, some evidence in favor of the Chinese. And again, I would say that the Americans would be really crazy to try to take on the Chinese, off their coast. Again, we're talking about a navy, which we've seen is vulnerable in the Red Sea. They're going to be that much more vulnerable fighting the Chinese in the South China Sea. And especially in this day and age, it's those aircraft and the naval vessels that are particularly vulnerable to these new missiles. You could feed, a landing on Taiwan. That's another thing that could be very difficult for the Chinese. But if it's going to be a battle between between the Chinese and the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Air Force, I think it would go very badly for the U.S. Air Force.
Yeah,
and the
for
U.S.
sure.
Navy, right?
For sure.
I mean, we could just see a total disaster. And I think a lot of people will jump to the conclusion, oh, the Chinese are by far the most superior military in the world. But you forgot what the Yemenis themselves showed.
You mean the United States is by far the most superior military?
No. I think people after this, if such a battle occurred and it was a catastrophe for the U.S., people would jump to the conclusion that the Chinese have by far the best military. Maybe they would be right, but that would be, I think, a mistake because we're talking about the change in technology, and we're already seeing it in places like Yemen, and what's like so. Yeah, it really makes navies and air forces very, very vulnerable.
Right. Yeah, I just hope that we come to our senses with this and start pulling out all of these bases. I mean, we have 800 plus, sometimes I hear 1,000 bases. What are they doing? What's their purpose? What's their function?
Yeah, I think it's inertia, more bureaucratic inertia. And, a lot of people have invested careers in bases, and there's a lot of money involved, but I think you're right, they really should, the vast majority of those should be shut down.
I mean,
for U.S. interests, again, I'm speaking as an American wanting the best thing for my country, the vast majority of those should be shut down. They're targets, and they're instruments of an imperialism that the U.S. needs to abandon, will be forced to abandon over time.
Right. I mean, couldn't we, Trump just upped the budget of the U.S. military to over $1 trillion now, or at $1 trillion? When the first couple of weeks after he got elected, or after he was inaugurated, he was saying that I want to cut it in half. I want to cut military, but now he's done this.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, that price tag is just so big. Is it possible to just say, let's repurpose our military, bring the bases home? Hey guys, you've got all this manpower, all this money. We can do R&D, all this stuff, but let's put you guys to work instead of building bases around the world. How about we build some high-speed rail here in the United States? Something that Americans can actually benefit from. So, infrastructure improvements. Do you think that's possible? Can't do that?
It's obviously possible. It would be very practical. The problem again is just these. First of all, there's the American exceptionalism. It would have to involve a recognition. Okay, we no longer rule the world. We can't rule the world. Let's come back home. Maybe we can rule the Western Hemisphere. That's I think what Trump is trying to do. Which I wouldn't be in favor of bullying neighboring countries, but it's better than trying to bully the whole world. It's eminently practical. It's just that there are ideological barriers, there are emotional barriers, and then there are also these institutional and barriers. Again, there's so much is invested in maintaining the current system. So many people make money off of it. So many people's careers depend on it that it's very hard to change. But that's the fight that he really should be fighting.
Well, let's hope that happens. All right, just one last question. These Chinese weapons are really interesting to me. I would love to learn more about them. Do we know if China has supplied, what countries it supplied arms to? I had no idea that Pakistan was even using Chinese equipment.
Yeah. Well, Pakistan and China have had a very close relationship for a long time. I think going back to the 1960s. I think another country that has them is UAE. I believe it's one of the Gulf monarchies decided to go with them. And there are others, but I can't.
It'll be interesting to see if there's I'm sure there's a website. Yeah,
another thing to point out, we're talking about, again, I don't say that this demonstrates the superiority of the J-10C over the Rafale. I don't think you can conclude that from that brief encounter. And then the fact again that there is this integration of different systems on the Pakistani side that gave them an advantage. But there's also a cost factor, which is very much in favor of the Chinese, that each one of these J-10Cs apparently costs $40 million. And then I've heard that the Rafales cost upwards, maybe as much as 240 million, which is just, mind-boggling. Now, I've heard that claim made a couple of times. I looked at the Wikipedia page, and it was more like 180 million. So it's somewhere from 180 to 240. Even if it's 180, that is just, still mind-bogglingly high, 40 million. So we're talking about a ratio of anywhere from 1 to 4.5 or 1 to 6 in favor of the Chinese, a cost ratio.
Right. No, that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, we know how efficient China is at producing, at manufacturing. They can create very advanced tech at very low prices. So, and it's just another just glaring example of how stupid it would be to go to war with China when they're able to just outproduce everybody in the world in essentially everything. So don't do it. Just don't do it. And they're not they're not an expanding imperialist force. There's no reason to. They're not threatening anybody in the world. So this idea of trying to go to war with China is one of the most absurd things I've heard.
Yeah, no, I agree. Right. It's China has, China's had conflicts with its neighbors. It has expanded over the centuries, over the, course of dynasties, but slowly, they have never shown them to be any sort of radical expansionist power, with dreams of world domination, or even, nothing like Israel, like what we're seeing. They are seizing land, and they've been seizing land ever since the state was created back in the 1948.
Mm. There's got to be some website out there that shows arms sales and tracks it over time, from country to country, quantities and dollar value signs, because I think that's going to be interesting to see. That we'll see a huge shift. We got to be seeing it already, but in the next 10 years or so, after this, Ukraine conflict pans out, after what we've seen happen in the Middle East, and just a little example here in India, Pakistan, with Chinese weapons, that we will see all of a sudden countries around the world at these arms expos saying like, do I spend $500 billion on this U.S. equipment here, or do I spend $20 billion and get something that seems to be more effective?
Yeah, maybe $100 million.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm just throwing out numbers, but you know what I mean. Just the idea of spending all this money on this equipment that it doesn't seem to be working that well, and that costs 10 times more than what the Chinese produce or the Russians produce. People will just make that economic decision, the rational choice, and be like, sorry. And then that's going to be that could be a death knell to the military industrial complex.
Right.
Who's going to buy our equipment?
Yeah.
NATO?
Well, that's one of the few, large export industries that we still have. And so, that would be a real blow to U.S. military and economic might.
Right. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the same as any other product. If you're on the open market, you're selling an inferior product at a higher price. It's, maybe you can fool people for a little bit and say it's this luxury brand, but if it doesn't function, I don't think these generals like, I got the Rolls Royce of, that's not what your military is supposed to be about.
Yeah. I think you're right. It's not a winning formula.
Okay. Well, we can end it there. We can, it's just food for thought thinking about that. But
Okay.
All right, Dad. Have a good rest of your day.
Okay. You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.